Now let's move on and start talking about political parties. And let's get a definition. A political party is a coalition of interest groups that sponsor candidates for political office under the organization's name. Okay, in America, in the United States, we have, in general, there's other political parties, but in general, it's the Democrats and Republicans. And both of these parties are basically a coalition or grouping of interest groups. Many different interest groups make up the Democrats and Republicans, and their main purpose is to sponsor candidates for political office under their name. They're running as a Republican, they're running as a Democrat, and the goal is to get people elected to implement policies that reflect the what the interest groups want. The whole goal is to get policy made by government that represents the will and the desires of the interest groups. Some basic functions of a political party in America is nominate candidates. We go through a nomination process, which we will talk about here in a little bit, but each party has their own electoral process to nominate candidates for all levels of office, all the way from local government to state level to Congress to the president. And each party has their separate elections. Those are called primary elections, nomination elections. Also, one of the functions of political parties is to structure the voting choice. Structure the voting choice. Republicans versus Democrats, R versus D. Their goal is to make it very simple for us because they don't want it to be too complicated to think about which party is best or which party they should vote for. They want the public to think about things in very, very simple terms. Basically, the Republicans would say Republicans good, Democrats bad. And Democrats would say Democrats good, Republicans bad. And give you very simple reasons why that is true. Republicans, hate America. Democrats hate America, so vote for us, whatever. But in reality, it simplifies and dumbs things down. Uh, in a perfect world, in a perfect democracy, we would all deeply study every policy, all the policies involved with each party, and what they're trying to do within the government system. But most people either don't have time or just don't want to use their time to do that kind of research. So they would rather watch TV and have somebody tell them that this is the way you should vote, and then just nod their head and go vote. Also, political parties should, especially the ones that are out of power, the minority parties in the different groups in Congress or in president, should propose alternative government programs. If the people elected a specific political party and they are running the government, and you want to challenge them, and you want to claim that you would be a better option than them, then you need to propose an alternative program. It doesn't work. Well, it may work, but it's not. It's really no good to say they're bad, vote for me, when you don't have an alternative, when you don't have something that you know a proposal that is actually better that you can implement once you get into office. And that is one of the problems with our current political system. We have a lot of political rhetoric being flown around, but nobody really proposes anything concrete. They just say they're bad, and so you should vote for me. And also coordinating actions of government officials. Once the political parties get into government, they want to coordinate the different levels of government and try to make persuade the government officials to implement policy in the way that the parties want. And so the whole goal is to just elect political members of their political party to implement the will or the desire of the interest groups that make up that political party. Now let's do a quick history of U.S. political parties, kind of get a quick rundown of how they have evolved over time. First, we had the pre-party period, which was pre-1796, and there were no political parties. Therefore, by definition, pre-party period makes perfect sense. And here's the thing: the founders did not like the idea of political parties. Actually, nowhere in the Constitution do they even mention political parties because they were very familiar with the political parties back in England. And their theory on political parties is when you have established political parties, oftentimes those political parties will put their own interests ahead of the interests of the nation. And of course, I think they're very prescient and very smart in recognizing that. But eventually, of course, parties are going to form when these, as we mentioned before, these interest groups or factions come together. But there were while there wasn't there weren't official political parties um, in the pre-party period before 1796. There were factions, and the factions are basically divisions or interest groups or divisions amongst political elites. And the factions at this time were the Federalists, who supported a strong central government, were more supportive of um, industrialization and commerce, uh, and believed in a strong central government, as I mentioned, and anti-federalists who believed in a state-level government was best, and that wanted a weak central government, and believed that a more agrarian economy or a farming economy would work best. So these were the kind of the early divisions between the different elites and the different groups in the United States, and there were the Federalists, the factions, not parties, factions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And of course, it's during this time that George Washington was president. And George Washington was not affiliated with either party. Although he leaned Federalist in many of his policies, he did not identify himself with either of these groups. And then starting in 1796, with the election of John Adams, who was a declared Federalist, and the Federalist political party had formed, it was what we call the first party period, 1796 to 1819. You had the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party, the intellectual leader was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was the intellectual leader of the Federalist Party. And Thomas Jefferson was the intellectual leader, or ideological leader, of the Democratic Republicans. So going back, of course, Hamilton was also the ideological leader. And and anyway, this was the first party period, and basically the two parties were an evolution or just a changing of the name from the factions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And as we mentioned before, the Federalists wanted strong central government, focus on commercial and industrial growth. The Democratic Republicans believed in a small central government, state power, and an agrarian or farming economy. And of course, it's during this time that the 12th Amendment was passed, which which dealt with the election of the president and the because one of the problem what happened was in the election, I believe it was of 1800, or was it 1804? 1800. There was a tie in the electoral college, and the 12th Amendment fixed that problem to where the a changing in the electoral college voting system in electing the president. Uh, but anyway, after the first party period, in 1819 to 1820, we convert into what we'll call the era of good feelings. Basically, the Democratic Republicans are the only party during this period. The Federalists have kind of gone away, and the reason for that is this was all a result of the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was a very controversial war. It was a war that was supported by the Democratic Republicans and vehemently resisted and by the Federalists, because the Federalists suffered economically the most with the embargoes that were put into place, the trade embargoes that harmed commercial interests, especially in New England. And so the Federalists were vocally against the War of 1812, and to some people's argument, they were actually almost treasonous in their resistance to the war. But in the end, we defeated Great Britain in the War of 1812, and it created a lot of patriotism, a lot of goodwill, a lot of pride in country. And so once that happened and we did win the war, the Federalists were seen as really as traitorous, and nobody wanted to be identified with the Federalists after this time. So they kind of went away, and it became just the Democratic Republicans as the main party in the United States. And this lasted up until about 1827. Then the second party period began in 1828, and it was all a result of the election of 1824, where you had five Democratic Republicans vying for the presidency, and they included Andrew Jackson, um, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay, among others. And what happened was that Andrew Jackson actually won the most total votes in the United States, And Andrew Jackson actually got the most electoral votes in the election. The only problem is he did not get a majority, meaning more than 50% of the electoral votes in the electoral college in the election. And by constitutional rule, you have to get a majority. And if you do not get a majority, then the House of Representatives decides who will be the president. Okay, so you have Andrew Jackson with the most votes and the most electoral college votes. And then you have John Quincy Adams second and Henry Clay third. And so it goes to the House of Representatives, and Andrew Jackson legitimately says, I have the right to win. I mean, I have the most votes of the people and the most electoral votes." But Jackson at this time was considered an outsider. He was not a traditional founder. His family lineage did not come from the founders. He was a grew up poor out west, what back then was West Tennessee, and so and he made his fame as a military leader in the War of 1812. So he was not part of the club, if you will, of the original uh, founding legacy of the country. And so what happened was Henry Clay decided to tell all of his supporters in the House of Representatives to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams. And you put Quincy Adams' support along with Clay's support together, and that creates a majority, and that gave John Quincy Adams the win. And immediately after that win, he appoints Henry Clay the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State office is basically the stepping stone to the presidency at this time in our history. Jefferson had been Washington's Secretary of State and become president. Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State. He became president. Monroe was Madison's Secretary of State. He became president. And on and on. So it was the stepping stone. So uh, Jackson's supporters called it a corrupt bargain. They said, look, you just traded the office of Secretary of State and a future presidency to Clay for your own victory in this election, and that's not fair. So what happened is Jackson and his supporters branched off from the Democratic Republican Party, created their own political party in the next election of 1828, and ran against John Quincy Adams again and defeated him. And it's at this point in 1828 that we enter the era of Jacksonian democracy. So, for testing purposes, the second party period, is also the era of Jacksonian democracy. Uh, and the opposing party that rose up out of this period would be the National Republicans, later called the Whigs. And basically, they were a bunch of people that just didn't like Jackson. And they formed their own party, National Republicans, and later the Whigs. And then we get to our current party system. The second party system runs till about 1856. And then, starting in 1856 to the current day, we have what's called our current party system, which consists of the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats and the Republicans. Now, the Democrats, of course, were formed in 1828 by Jackson and his supporters. From 1828 on up to 1856, the opposition to the Democrats were was a mishmash of National Republicans, Whigs. Later, some third parties popped in. But what happened was the issue of slavery coalesced a bunch of anti-Jacksonians and other groups to come together to form one political party under the banner of opposing the expansion of slavery. Opposing the expansion of slavery. And this party turned into the Republicans. Uh, and it consists of anti slavery Whigs and Northern Democrats. Okay, now the Democratic Party, there was a North and South faction of the Democrats. The Southern Democrats, of course, supported slavery. The Southern Whigs, of course, supported slavery. But those in the North who didn't support the expansion of slavery had nowhere to go. They didn't have a political home. So those two parties, along with some other third parties, formed the Republicans as the party. Now, I want to make this clear. It's not an abolitionist party at this point. They're not calling for the abolition of slavery. It's basically they're calling to stop any expansion of slavery. So it's formed in 1856, and they actually run a person for president and lose. But in 1860, this is the pivotal election, the critical election that realigns or resets loyalties within the political parties for the long term. First of all, the Republicans, that anti-expansion of slavery party, they choose Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown um, uh, congressman from Illinois, and they run him because of his success in debating the position of the Republicans um, on the issue of slavery. The Democrats have a problem because they're split. They have the Southern Democrats, which are vehemently, pro-slavery. You have the Northern Democrats that are generally anti-slavery. You have the Constitutional Union Party, which is a faction of Democrats that are kind of just saying, let's forget about it and move on to something else. But the Democrats split their votes in the election of 1860, and by splitting the vote, that allows Lincoln to win without even winning one Southern state. So Lincoln wins in the critical election of 1860, and it's about this point that the two political parties, Democrats and Republicans, really establish themselves. After the Civil War, you tend to have a rough balance between who controls Congress and who controls the presidency between 1860 and 1894. Then you have an era of Republican dominance from 1896 to 1930. The Progressive era is in that period between 1900 and 1920, and it's Progressive era where both political parties have a progressive ideology. They all kind of think the same way and how to solve the nation's problems in a progressive or liberal type way. And so that runs till about 1830 with the election of this Republican dominance, and it changes in 1930. I'm sorry, 1930. Um, with the election of with the start of the Great Depression actually, and then Democratic dominance starting in 1932 with the election of Franklin Roosevelt as president and Democratic control of Congress up until 1964, and then from about 1964, 1968 up until today. We have a rough balance. Occasionally we'll have a Republican president, occasionally we'll have a Democratic president, occasionally Republicans will control Congress, occasionally Democrats will control Congress. And that's what we mean by rough balance. Now, while the Democrats and Republicans are the main parties in the United States, we know that there are other political parties that exist today, and there are plenty of other political parties that have existed in the past. Some that were relatively successful, although no third party has ever, since the establishment of the two party system, no third party has ever won a major election, specifically the presidency. But there have been a series of minor parties, or we'll call third parties. Either way, minor parties or third parties. One type is a bolter party. These parties leave the existing party. There's a faction or a couple of factions or a couple of interest groups within an existing party that is not happy with the way the party is, where the party is going, what they're supporting, how they're voting. So they break off. They bolt from the existing party. Uh, Two examples of this are the Progressive Party in the during the Progressive era that bolted from the Republican Party. The Progressive Party, or also the Bull Moose Party, was Teddy Roosevelt moving his supporters out of the Republican Party and running separately as a progressive. Then the Dixiecrats in the 1940s, who were unhappy with, they were Democrats, and then they were unhappy with the Northern Democrats, especially uh, in their policies, especially embracing civil rights. And so the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, bolted from the Democratic Party in the early to mid 1900s, and ran their own candidate for president and actually won a couple of electoral votes. Also, you have farm labor parties. The most notable is the Populist Party. The Populist Party was a coalition of people who supported policies that helped farmers and laborers, um, workers, union members, things like that. Then there's ideological parties, those that exist sheerly not for any specific group, not representing the interests of any specific faction or interest group, but they represent and they adhere closely to representing and supporting a specific ideology, a specific way in which the government and they're usually very rigid in their support of this, that this is the only way and we must do it exactly how the ideology states. And the libertarians, which support very, very, very little government intervention in our society at all, and the socialists, which support a government controlled or government, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Not really controlled, but an economy that is greatly regulated by the government. Also, there are single issue parties that pop up. These are parties that arise over one issue that becomes very polarizing or very important to the public. Uh, One of the earliest ones was the anti-Masonic Party, and it rose up in opposition to uh, the Freemasons, which is actually a kind of a society, a secret society. Uh, the Freemasons. A lot of people had a conspiracy theory that this secret group of Freemasons was running the world, running the country, and so this political party rose up, against anybody that was a Mason. Free Soil Party, which was one of the early parties that challenged the expansion of slavery. Free soil for free men, that was their motto. And then the Prohibition Party, which is basically a political party that rallied around the abolition of alcohol, the outlawing of alcohol. Now, minor party lack of success. One of the reasons major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, get in power and stay in power is they have a broad coalition. There's lots of different groups that make up the Democrats and the Republicans, and they stay with the Democrats and Republicans because they're the most likely ones to win. You you want to align yourself with the winner. You can jump onto a third party. Um, you can jump onto a third party and try to support them, but chances are you're not going to win. So you're going to probably go back and end up choosing one of the other political parties that best represents your beliefs. Also, if a third party rises up over a single issue or a group of issues and becomes relatively popular, maybe getting 5 or 10% of the vote, the other parties, the Democrats or the Republicans, are going to see that and they're going to embrace that issue. They're going to say, "What heck? I'm not going to let that third party have 10% of the vote or 5% of the vote over that issue. I'm going to make that issue my own." So maybe either the Republicans or the Democrats will start talking about that issue that gave rise to the third party. And when they capture the issue and they take that issue and make it their own, the third party goes away. Another reason for minor party lack of success is the winner take all plurality system of our election. There's only one representative from any district, and that comes in congressional elections. The All it takes is a plurality of votes to win a congressional election in the general election. You don't have to get a majority, and so generally one of the major parties are always going to get a plurality. But minor party influence does play a role. Minor parties can take enough votes from one party or another in a major election to tip the balance. Good examples are the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, where the Green Party and Ralph Nader, they only won about 3% of the vote, 2 to 3%. But that 2 to 3% that voted for the Green Party, if the Green Party had not run, many political scientists and historians argue that much of that vote would have gone to Al Gore and tipped the election towards Al Gore instead of George W. Bush, and that changes history. So minor parties can influence election even without actually winning the election. This is a really good flow chart showing the history of American political parties at a glance, as the name of it. And basically, it shows early on the Federalists were the first party to establish themselves, and in response, the Democratic Republicans pop up in 1796, thereby starting what we'll call the first party system. And then you see that time period between it's shown between 1820 in 1824, which is really, yeah, that's right, my bad. That's the era of good feelings, where there's only Democratic Republicans, and then the National Republicans and Whigs pop up to challenge the Democrats, and then starting in 1856, you just have the blue and the red, the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, farther to the right side, you see some periods, and as you can see, there's a lot of third parties that have popped up during American history. But as you can see, most of them don't last very long. They last for 1 or 2 election cycles, maybe 3, like the Prohibition Party. But for the most part, they don't last very long because of the reasons we talked about earlier: the capturing of the issues, the difficulty in winning elections. But you see the Prohibition Party, maybe the most prominent one there.